Power is never lost in a single night, it is taken, quietly, by the one you never thought was watching. The pen hovered between Naomi Carter's fingers, its weight heavier than the skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. Manhattan shimmered in gold and steel, a city built on ambition, and tonight, something in that city was about to change hands without a single raised voice. Across the polished mahogany table sat men who had spent their lives believing they understood power, their tailored suits immaculate, their expressions carefully neutral, yet beneath that calm was something new, something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Naomi didn't rush, she never did, her movements were measured, deliberate, as if time itself had learned to follow her rhythm. The contract lay open before her, pages of legal precision, clauses woven like threads in a design only she had fully seen from the beginning. At the far end of the room, Alexander Whitmore stood still, too still, his reflection caught faintly in the glass behind her. A man who had once commanded rooms with a glance now watching in silence as the center of gravity shifted away from him, inch by inch, decision by decision. Naomi finally lowered the pen and signed her name. The ink flowed smoothly, effortlessly, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. A quiet sound, barely audible, yet it echoed louder than any applause. The room didn't erupt, there was no spectacle, only a subtle shift, a recalibration of power that every person present could feel but none dared to interrupt. Naomi closed the folder. With a soft, precise motion, her expression composed, almost serene, but there was something else beneath it, not anger, not triumph, something steadier, something earned. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her black dress, the material catching the light just enough to reflect strength rather than decoration. Across from her, Alexander finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, but edged with disbelief. "You planned this, it wasn't a question." "Not really." Naomi met his gaze for the first time that night, her eyes calm, unwavering. "No," she said softly, "I prepared for it." The distinction settled between them like a line drawn in stone. Years ago, he would have dismissed it, dismissed her, dismissed everything she represented, but tonight, there was no room for dismissal, only realization. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, as if marking the passing of something old and the arrival of something inevitable, a new ownership, a new order, a new truth. Naomi turned toward the window for a brief moment, her reflection merging with the skyline. She had stood in this same city once before, in a different room, wearing a different version of herself, quieter, smaller, invisible in ways that had suited everyone but her. Back then, she had learned to listen instead of speak, to observe instead of interrupt, to understand instead of react. It had never been weakness, not once. It had been strategy. Behind her, the board members began to gather their things, murmurs low and careful, no one eager to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened, because to acknowledge it meant admitting they had never seen it coming. Naomi picked up the folder, her name now tied to every asset, every decision, every future outcome that once belonged to the man standing across from her. She didn't look back immediately. She didn't need to. She could feel his presence, the weight of his realization, the slow unraveling of certainty that had once defined him. When she finally turned, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You built something remarkable," she said, and for a moment, it sounded like respect, like recognition. But then she continued, her tone unchanged, "You just never noticed who was holding it together." The words didn't cut, they didn't need to. They simply existed, undeniable and complete. Alexander didn't respond, not because he couldn't, but because for the first time, he understood that anything he said would come too late. Naomi gave a small nod, not of approval, not of farewell, but of closure. Then she walked past him, her steps quiet against the marble floor, each one carrying her further from the version of herself he had once believed in, and closer to the truth she had always known. Behind her, the room remained intact, the skyline unchanged, the empire still standing, but its foundation, its ownership, its future, had shifted entirely in a single, silent night. The city had not changed, but everything inside Naomi Carter had. 5 years earlier the same skyline had looked impossibly distant from the narrow window of a modest apartment in Queens where the radiator hissed louder than her own thoughts and the air smelled faintly of old paint and persistence. She stood barefoot on cold hardwood floors that creaked under even the lightest step, a single suitcase resting near the door, half packed, half abandoned, as if it too was uncertain whether leaving meant loss or liberation. Behind her, the television murmured financial news that she no longer watched but listened to with a different kind of attention. Numbers, mergers, acquisitions. The language of power she had once been told she would never understand. Her phone lay face down on The small kitchen counter, silent, no calls, no apologies, no acknowledgement of what had been erased overnight. Naomi reached for the window, pressing her fingertips against the glass, cool and steady, grounding her in a reality that no longer included the life she had built beside Alexander Whitmore. She did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because something deeper had already taken hold, something quieter, sharper, resolve. She turned away from the window and walked toward the small table where a single laptop sat open, its screen filled with documents she had memorized long before anyone realized she had been paying attention, spreadsheets, projections, internal reports she had once organized as a dutiful wife, now transformed into a map, a blueprint, a future no one else could see. Her reflection caught briefly in the dark screen as it dimmed, no longer the woman who waited to be noticed, but not yet the one who would be remembered, somewhere in between, a place most people never survive, but she did not rush through it. She studied it, learned its edges, its silence, its discipline. Days turned into weeks measured not by comfort but by progress, early mornings before the city fully woke, late nights when the noise faded and clarity sharpened. She enrolled in courses no one knew about, finance, corporate law, strategic investments, each lesson a piece of armor, each concept another step away from invisibility. She learned how companies rose, how they failed, how power was never about volume but about timing, and most importantly, about information. She worked quietly at a small consulting firm downtown, unnoticed, underpaid, but positioned exactly where she needed to be, watching deals unfold, observing negotiations, understanding the patterns behind decisions that shaped entire industries. She never asked for recognition. She did not need it. Recognition was loud. And she was building something that required silence. On weekends she walked through the city not as a visitor but as a student, studying buildings, headquarters, the invisible networks that connected them. She memorized names, faces, movements, learning who mattered and why. She kept her expenses minimal, her lifestyle simple, every dollar saved redirected into something far more valuable than comfort, leverage. Her first investment was small, almost invisible. A minor stake in a company no one was watching, but she was not investing in the company, she was investing in the process, understanding how ownership shifted, how influence could grow quietly over time. Months passed, then years, and with each one, Naomi refined not just her knowledge, but her patience, because patience, she discovered, was the rarest form of power. While others chased quick success, she built slow certainty. While others spoke loudly in boardrooms, she listened from the edges, collecting pieces of a puzzle they did not know existed. Occasionally, she would hear his name, Alexander Whitmore, still commanding headlines, still expanding, still admired, and each time, she felt nothing that resembled bitterness, only clarity, because she understood something he did not. Empires are not lost in moments of chaos, they are lost in moments of assumption, and he had assumed she was nothing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline casting long shadows across her apartment, Naomi closed her laptop and allowed herself a rare pause. The room was still modest, the life still simple. But beneath that simplicity was something vast, something carefully constructed. She picked up a folder from the table, its contents precise, organized, intentional, the early stages of something that would take years to complete but only a single night to reveal. She traced her name lightly across the top page, not as a reminder of who she had been, but as a declaration of who she was becoming. Then she set it down, turned off the light, and let the room fall into quiet darkness, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something waiting, something inevitable, something that would one day walk into a room of powerful men and change everything without raising its voice. The first time Naomi Carter stepped back into a room where Alexander Whitmore's name carried weight, no one noticed her, and that was exactly how she intended it. The venue was a private investment forum held on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson River, the kind of place where deals were not announced but decided, where conversations happened in low voices over aged whiskey and polished confidence. Naomi stood near the edge of the room, her presence understated, her navy suit tailored but unremarkable to the untrained eye. She was not there to be seen, she was there to observe, to confirm, to measure. Across the room, a group of executives spoke in careful tones about expansion, risk, and opportunity, and then his name surfaced. Again, Alexander Whitmore. His company still growing, still admired, still considered untouchable. Naomi listened without expression, her posture relaxed, her eyes attentive, because what they described as strength, she recognized as overextension, what they called bold strategy, she saw as impatience dressed in confidence. She moved slowly through the room, pausing just long enough at conversations to gather fragments, numbers, timelines, partnerships that looked impressive on paper but fragile under pressure. No one questioned her presence. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged, and in rooms like this, belonging was rarely challenged if it was worn convincingly. Later that evening, she stepped onto the terrace, the city stretching endlessly beneath her, the wind catching the edge of her blazer, reminding her of nights long ago when she had stood in silence and listened from a distance. Now she stood closer, not at the center, but near enough to feel the shift. A man approached her, mid-50s, sharp eyes, the kind of investor who measured people before numbers. "You have been listening more than speaking," he said, not unkindly. Naomi offered a slight smile. "Controlled, precise, that is where the value usually is," she replied. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, as if filing her away for later consideration, and that was enough. Naomi did not chase opportunities. She positioned herself where they would eventually find her. Over the following months, her presence in these circles became familiar but never predictable. She attended selectively, spoke sparingly, and when she did speak, it was never to impress, only to clarify. Her insights were sharp but delivered without ego, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to listen, not because she demanded attention, but because her observations proved accurate, again and again. She built connections the same way she built everything else, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. A lawyer here, a financial analyst there, a partner who valued discretion over publicity, each relationship another thread woven into a network that no one could see as a whole. During one meeting, a discussion surfaced about a potential vulnerability in Whitmore Holdings. Nothing public, nothing confirmed, just a subtle concern about liquidity tied to an aggressive expansion into overseas markets. Naomi did not react outwardly, but internally. The pieces began to align. She had studied those reports, traced those movements, anticipated that pressure point years ago, and now, it was beginning to surface exactly as she had calculated. She waited, because timing was everything. Acting too early would expose intention, acting too late would lose advantage. She chose neither. She chose precision. Weeks later, she made her move, not through a dramatic acquisition, not through a headline, but through a series of quiet investments routed through entities that carried no obvious connection to her, each one small on its own, insignificant even, but together forming something far more substantial, a position, a foothold, a future leverage point. She monitored the response carefully. The market did not react, the board did not notice, and Alexander Whitmore continued forward, unaware that the ground beneath him was being reshaped. One evening, as Naomi reviewed her portfolio from her now larger but still understated apartment, she paused at a familiar name. Whitmore Holdings. Her ownership was still minor, almost invisible, but it was no longer zero, and that mattered more than anything else. She leaned back in her chair, the city lights reflecting softly across the glass of her window, and allowed herself a single moment of acknowledgement, not pride, not satisfaction, but recognition. This was no longer preparation, this was execution, slow, controlled, inevitable. She closed the file and turned off the light, leaving only the glow of the city beyond, a city that rewarded those who understood its rules and rewrote them quietly when no one was looking. And somewhere within that system, Naomi Carter had begun to shift something that would take years to reveal but only seconds to understand once it did, because by the time anyone realized what she had built, it would already belong to her. The first sign was not a collapse, not a headline, not even a rumor. It was a hesitation, subtle, almost polite, a delay in execution that no one outside the inner circle would recognize, but Naomi Carter did. Because she had been waiting for it. Across the financial reports that streamed quietly across her screen late one evening, she noticed the shift, a deviation so small it could be dismissed by anyone not looking closely. Whitmore Holdings had begun to stretch beyond its natural rhythm, payments extended just slightly longer, acquisitions closing with a fraction more urgency than precision. Nothing reckless, nothing obvious, but enough to suggest something deeper, something structural. She did not react immediately. She never did. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, allowing the information to settle, to connect, to confirm what she had already suspected. Overextension was not a mistake, it was a pattern, and patterns, once identified, could be guided. She reached for her notebook, not the digital file she used for transactions, but the physical one she reserved for strategy, its pages filled with clean, deliberate handwriting. Timelines, projections, relationships mapped not by numbers alone but by influence. She traced a line she had drawn months earlier, connecting Whitmore Holdings to a series of international ventures that looked impressive from the outside but carried unseen dependencies, suppliers, partners, financing structures that relied heavily on timing and trust, she had learned, was the most fragile asset of all. The next morning, she made a call, brief, precise, to a contact she had cultivated quietly over 2 years, a senior analyst within a private equity firm known for its discretion. She did not ask for favors, she presented information, carefully framed, allowing the analyst to reach his own conclusion, that a certain position, a certain timing, could yield significant advantage if approached correctly. She did not mention Whitmore by name, she did not need to, the pattern was clear to anyone trained to see it, and by the end of the conversation, a small shift had been set in motion, not an attack, not a disruption, just a recalibration, a slight tightening of terms, a subtle adjustment of confidence, enough to create pressure without revealing intent. Days passed, then weeks, and the effect began to ripple outward, slowly, invisibly. Partners who once moved quickly began to ask more questions, timelines extended, negotiations grew more cautious, nothing that could be traced back, nothing that could be accused, only a gradual erosion of certainty. Naomi watched it unfold with the same calm focus she had maintained from the beginning. She did not celebrate. She did not rush, she simply adjusted her position accordingly, increasing her holdings through channels that remained separate, led, protected, each acquisition another piece of a structure that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. One afternoon, she attended a closed meeting where a discussion emerged about market confidence, not in general terms, but specifically around companies that expanded too aggressively without reinforcing their foundation. Again, his name was not spoken directly, but it hovered just beneath the surface of every comment, every concern. Naomi remained silent, her expression neutral, but internally, she noted the shift. Perception was beginning to change, and perception, in this world, was often more powerful than reality. Later that evening, she stood once again by her window, the city alive with movement and light, but her focus remained inward, on the sequence she had constructed, each step aligning with the next, each decision reinforcing the outcome she had envisioned years ago. Her phone vibrated softly on the table behind her, a message from one of her advisors, concise, efficient, confirming that another key position had been secured. She read it once, then set the phone down without response. Acknowledgement was unnecessary, the work spoke for itself. Across the city, in an office far above the streets, Alexander Whitmore reviewed reports that no longer aligned with his expectations, numbers that once followed predictable patterns now showing resistance, delays that could not be explained by market conditions alone. He adjusted, he strategized, he pushed forward, because that was what he had always done, what had always worked. But this time, the system was no longer responding in the same way, because this time, the system had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. Naomi turned away from the window and walked toward her desk. Her movement steady, unhurried. She opened the folder that had grown thicker over the years, its contents no longer theoretical, no longer preparatory, but active, alive, each page representing a decision already made, a path already set. She paused for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the top sheet, not in hesitation, but in recognition. The shift was no longer coming, it was happening, and by the time anyone understood its full scope, it would be too late to reverse. She closed the folder with a soft, final motion, the sound barely audible, but definitive. Then she turned off the light, leaving only the city beyond, vast, indifferent, and unknowingly aligned with a plan that had been unfolding in silence, one precise step at a time. Control did not break all at once, it thinned, like tension stretched too far across something that once felt unshakable. In the weeks that followed, Naomi Carter watched the pattern deepen with a calm that came not from detachment but from certainty. Every indicator she had mapped years ago began to surface in quiet alignment. Delayed approvals, renegotiated contracts, partners who once moved without hesitation now pausing just long enough to change the rhythm of entire transactions. And rhythm, she knew, was everything. Once it faltered, everything else followed. She sat at her desk early one morning, the first light of the city slipping between buildings and casting long reflections across her glass table, her laptop open, a series of financial dashboards unfolding in clean, precise columns, each number telling a story that most people would miss, but she read them like language, fluid, intentional, revealing. Whitmore Holdings was not collapsing, not yet, but it was beginning to carry weight it had not accounted for, obligations layered over expectations, commitments stacked against assumptions, and beneath it all, a growing strain that could not be seen from the outside. She took a slow breath, not out of anxiety, but to steady the moment, because this was where most people made mistakes. They rushed when they saw movement, they reacted when they sensed weakness, but Naomi did neither. She adjusted. A single instruction sent to one of her legal advisors. A subtle redirection of capital through a secondary channel, a timing shift in an acquisition that would place her closer to the center of influence without ever appearing there. Each action small, deliberate, invisible on its own, but together, forming something undeniable. Later that afternoon, she attended another private meeting, smaller this time, more selective. The kind where conversations were less guarded because everyone believed they were among equals. She took her usual place. Slightly off-center, present but not dominant, listening as a senior partner discussed concerns about market stability, his tone measured but cautious. "There is a difference between growth and strain," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "and some companies forget where that line is." A few heads nodded, quiet agreement passing between them. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, but internally, she marked the shift. Perception was no longer neutral, it was leaning, and once perception leaned, it did not easily return. After the meeting, she stepped into the elevator alone, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of herself that had taken years to build, composed, controlled, unrecognizable to anyone who had once overlooked her. As the doors closed, her phone vibrated softly. A message from a contact embedded within one of Whitmore's overseas ventures, concise, factual, confirming a delay in funding that had not yet been disclosed publicly. Naomi read it once, then again, not because she needed to understand it, but because she respected the precision of timing. This was the opening, not dramatic, not explosive, but definitive. She stepped out onto the street, the noise of the city rising around her, taxis moving in steady lines, people passing without noticing, everything continuing as if nothing had changed. And that was the point, the most significant shifts never announced themselves. They unfolded beneath the surface until the outcome was already sealed. That evening, she returned to her apartment, the space now larger, refined, but still intentionally restrained. No excess, no distraction, just clarity. She placed her bag on the table and moved directly to her desk, opening the folder that had become the center of everything, its pages now dense with action. Transactions completed, position secured, leverage established. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the paper, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement. The plan was no longer theoretical, it was active, and it was working. Across the city, Alexander Whitmore stood in his office, reviewing reports that no longer followed his expectations, his reflection faint in the glass behind him, a man accustomed to control now facing variables that refused to align. He made calls, issued directives, adjusted strategies. But each correction seemed to meet resistance, subtle, untraceable, as if the system itself had shifted beyond his reach. Naomi closed the folder slowly, the motion deliberate, final in a way that did not require sound. She turned toward the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, lights flickering on as evening settled in, and for the first time, she allowed herself to recognize the truth fully. This was no longer about recovery, no longer about proving anything to anyone. This was about completion, about bringing something carefully constructed into full view. She reached for her phone and sent a single message, brief, precise, initiating the next phase. Then she set it down, her expression calm, her posture steady, because she understood something that no one else in that city did yet. The moment of realization was approaching, and when it arrived, it would not be loud, it would not be chaotic, it would be quiet, controlled, and absolute, just like everything she had built. The shift from pressure to fracture did not announce itself with noise. It arrived in silence, in the kind of silence that spreads through a room when certainty begins to disappear. Naomi Carter recognized it the moment she opened the latest set of reports, not because the numbers were alarming, but because they no longer aligned with the story they were supposed to tell. Revenue projections remained strong on the surface. Expansion plans still appeared ambitious, but underneath, the timing was off, the flow disrupted. Capital that should have moved seamlessly now hesitated, and hesitation in a system built on precision was never accidental. She sat still for a moment, letting the realization settle, not as surprise, but as confirmation. This was the phase she had designed for, the point where structure begins to respond to invisible forces, where decisions made months or years ago start to reveal their consequences. She reached for her phone and reviewed a series of updates from her network, each one small, each one independent, but together forming a pattern too consistent to ignore: a supplier renegotiating terms, a partner delaying commitment, a lender requesting additional assurances, none of it dramatic, none of it public, but all of it connected. She placed the phone down carefully, her movements deliberate, because this was where precision mattered most, not in creating disruption, but in guiding it. She opened her laptop and initiated the next sequence: a calculated increase in her position, routed through entities that remained insulated from direct association, each transaction executed with the same restraint she had practiced from the beginning: no sudden moves, no visible intent, only steady accumulation. Later that afternoon, she received an invitation, a closed board discussion regarding market stability and corporate positioning. The kind of meeting where decisions were not officially made, but quietly agreed upon. She accepted without hesitation, arriving exactly on time, her presence noted but not questioned. She took her seat, hands resting lightly on the table, her expression composed. The conversation began with general observations, shifting gradually toward specific concerns: liquidity, expansion, sustainability, words that carried weight without accusation. And then, inevitably, the focus narrowed. Whitmore Holdings was not named immediately, but it did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood the reference. Naomi listened, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. Because she had already moved beyond discussion, what they were analyzing, she had already set in motion. One of the board members, a man known for his cautious approach, spoke with quiet authority: confidence is not just built on numbers, it is built on consistency, and once that consistency is questioned, everything else becomes fragile. A subtle shift passed through the room. Not agreement, not yet, but recognition. Naomi noted it without reaction, because recognition was the beginning of alignment. And alignment was what transformed possibility into inevitability. After the meeting, she stepped outside into the evening air, the city alive with motion, headlights tracing lines through the streets, voices blending into a constant hum, everything appearing unchanged, and yet, beneath it, something fundamental had shifted. She walked slowly, her heels measured against the pavement, her mind not racing, not calculating, but settling into the clarity that came only after long preparation met the right moment. Across the city, Alexander Whitmore stood in his office, the lights dimmed except for the glow of screens displaying data that no longer responded to his control. He adjusted forecasts, restructured timelines, reached out to partners who now responded with careful distance instead of immediate assurance. He was not failing, not in the way the world would recognize, but he was losing alignment, and without alignment, even the strongest systems begin to drift. Naomi reached her building and paused briefly before entering, her reflection catching in the glass, not as a moment of vanity, but as acknowledgement. She had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed, not because of any single decision, but because of the accumulation of all of them. She stepped inside, the lobby quiet, refined, a space that reflected control without excess. She moved toward the elevator, her posture relaxed, her presence unremarkable to those who did not know what she carried. Inside her apartment, she set her bag down and moved directly to her desk, opening the folder that had guided every step, its contents now complete in a way that required no further revision. She reviewed the final page, a summary not of plans, but of outcomes already unfolding. Then she closed it slowly, her hand resting for a moment on the cover, not in hesitation, but in recognition. The system had shifted, the balance had changed, and the final stage was no longer approaching, it had begun. She turned toward the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, lights steady, indifferent, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to stand still, not as the woman who had been overlooked, not as the one who had endured, but as the one who had understood, who had waited, who had built something that did not need to announce itself to be absolute. Then she reached for her phone, sent one final instruction, and placed it back on the table, her expression calm, her presence unwavering, because she knew what the rest of the city did not yet see. The moment of realization was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable, and when it arrived, it would not ask for attention, it would simply take its place. The moment did not arrive with chaos, it arrived with a meeting, scheduled, structured, and deceptively routine. Naomi Carter entered the boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, her steps measured, her presence calm. The city behind her bathed in soft daylight that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, clean lines across the polished table where decisions had once been made without question. Today, Those decisions would be reconsidered, one by one. The room was already filled, executives seated in their usual positions, legal advisors aligned along the sides, each face composed, each posture controlled, yet beneath that control was something new, tension, not loud, not visible, but present in the slight delay before conversations began, in the way eyes shifted toward the documents placed neatly before them. Naomi took her seat without announcement, placing her folder on the table with a quiet precision that drew no attention and yet commanded awareness. Across from her, Alexander Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his posture still firm, his expression still disciplined, but the certainty that had once defined him now carried a subtle edge, something strained beneath the surface. The meeting began as expected, financial summaries, operational updates, projections carefully presented in language designed to reassure, but reassurance requires belief, and belief had already begun to erode. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her hands resting lightly against the table, because this was not the moment to speak, not yet. The conversation shifted gradually, as it always did, from presentation to questioning, from confidence to scrutiny. A board member raised a concern about liquidity, another about delayed commitments, each point delivered with professional restraint, yet building toward something undeniable. Alexander responded with clarity, with strategy, with the same authority that had guided him through every challenge before. But this time, the responses did not settle the room, they lingered, unresolved. Naomi observed the shift carefully, because this was the exact moment she had anticipated, the point where control begins to separate from perception. She reached for her folder and opened it slowly, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of a sequence already in motion. The sound of paper against the table was soft, deliberate, yet it carried weight, because timing transforms even the smallest action into significance. She slid a single document forward, placing it within the center of the table, her voice calm, precise. Before we proceed further, there is an update that should be acknowledged. The room stilled, not abruptly, but completely, attention shifting toward her in a way it never had before. Alexander's gaze met hers, steady, questioning, aware that something had changed but not yet understanding how. Naomi continued without raising her voice. Over the past several months, a series of positions have been acquired through independent entities. Those positions now represent a controlling interest. The word settled into the room with a clarity that required no emphasis, no repetition. A pause followed, not confusion, but realization beginning to take shape. One of the legal advisors reached for the document, scanning its contents, his expression shifting from neutrality to recognition, then to confirmation. "This is accurate," he said quietly, the statement simple, but final. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. The structure had changed, the ownership had shifted, and it had done so without resistance, without warning. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, because this was not a moment of triumph, it was a moment of completion. Alexander leaned back slightly, his gaze still fixed on her, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with something deeper, understanding, the kind that arrives too late to alter the outcome. "You orchestrated this," he said, his voice controlled, measured. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she replied softly, "I aligned it." The distinction settled between them, precise, undeniable. Around them, the board members adjusted, recalibrating their positions, their responsibilities, their understanding of the structure they were now part of. Naomi closed the folder gently, her hand resting briefly against its surface. Then she stood, not to dominate the room, but to define it, her voice steady, carrying without force. "The company will continue operations without disruption, existing leadership will remain in place pending review, and all commitments will be honored as scheduled." Her words were not declarations of power, but assurances of stability, because true control does not create chaos, it removes it. The tension in the room shifted, not disappearing, but transforming into something more focused, more aligned. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving once more to Alexander, not as a confrontation, but as acknowledgement. "This was never about taking anything," she said quietly, "it was about recognizing what was already unprotected." The words did not accuse, they clarified, and in that clarity, everything became undeniable. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had changed entirely. Decisions now moved through her, not around her, and every person in that room understood it without needing it to be stated again. Outside, the city continued as it always had, traffic moving, people walking, unaware that within a single room, without noise, without spectacle, something fundamental had shifted. and at the center of it, Naomi Carter stood not as someone who had taken power, but as someone who had understood it long before anyone else realized it was available. Silence does not end when the meeting adjourns, it lingers, reshaping everything it touches. Naomi Carter stepped out of the boardroom without urgency, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, yet behind her, the room no longer belonged to the same structure. Voices resumed in lower tones, conversations recalibrated, but the center had shifted and everyone present understood it. She moved down the corridor lined with glass walls and muted reflections. The kind of space designed to project transparency while concealing the real negotiations that defined power. Her heels echoed softly against the marble floor, a rhythm that matched the clarity of her thoughts. No hesitation, no second guessing, because there was nothing left to reconsider. The plan had reached its conclusion and the outcome was already in motion. As she reached the elevator, she paused briefly, not to reflect on what had happened, but to recognize what had changed. Not the company, not the city, but the perception of her place within it. The doors opened with a quiet glide and she stepped inside, alone, the mirrored walls catching her image from every angle. A woman composed, controlled, defined not by reaction but by intention. The elevator descended smoothly, floor by floor, each number marking a transition not just in space but in identity. When the doors opened to the lobby, the environment felt unchanged, polished stone, soft lighting, quiet conversations, yet beneath it all, the alignment had shifted. She walked past the reception desk without pause, the staff offering polite acknowledgement, unaware of the significance carried in her presence. Outside, the city greeted her with its usual motion, taxis moving in precise patterns, pedestrians crossing with purpose. Everything continuing as it always had, because the most significant changes rarely announce themselves to the world at large. They settle quietly into place and allow the rest to adjust. Across the street, a black car waited, understated, its driver already aware of her arrival. Naomi entered without a word, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the moment in a space defined by quiet control. As the car moved forward, the skyline shifted in reflection across the window, buildings rising and receding in a pattern she had studied for years, not just as architecture, but as symbols of ambition, of risk, of systems built and rebuilt over time. Her phone rested on her lap, silent, because there was no need for immediate communication. Everything that needed to be said had already been executed. Across the city, in an office that no longer held the same authority, Alexander Whitmore remained seated long after the meeting had ended, the documents still spread before him, their contents unchanged, yet their meaning entirely different. He did not react with anger, not outwardly. Instead, he reviewed, he traced the sequence backward, searching for the moment where control had shifted. But the realization he encountered was not a single point of failure. It was a pattern of assumption, a series of overlooked details that had accumulated into something irreversible. He stood slowly, moving toward the window that had once represented dominance over the city, now reflecting. A man reconsidering everything he thought he understood about power. Back in the car, Naomi watched the same skyline from a different perspective, not above it, not below it, but within it, integrated into its rhythm in a way she had never been before. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of traffic softening into a distant hum, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to exhale, not in relief, but in completion. She reached into her bag and retrieved the folder, the same one that had guided her through years of preparation, its edges now softened from use, its contents no longer evolving but resolved. She opened it to the final page, not to review, but to acknowledge. Every line, every decision, every calculation had led here, to a moment that required no further action, only presence. She closed it gently and placed it beside her, her gaze returning to the window as the city moved around her. Unchanged and yet entirely different, because now, she was no longer observing from the margins. She was part of the structure itself, and that structure would move according to a new alignment, one defined not by volume or visibility, but by precision, by patience, by the quiet certainty of someone who had understood the rules long before anyone else realized they could be rewritten. The car came to a stop in front of her building, the driver stepping out to open the door. Naomi exited with the same measured grace, her steps carrying her forward without pause. Inside, the lobby greeted her with its familiar calm, a space that reflected order without excess. She moved toward the elevator, her reflection briefly catching in the polished surface of the doors, not as a moment of vanity, but as confirmation. She had not become something new, she had revealed what had always been there. The elevator carried her upward, floor by floor, until the doors opened into her private space, quiet, controlled, intentional. She stepped inside, setting the folder on the table, her movements unhurried, because there was no longer any need to move quickly. She walked to the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, lights beginning to glow as evening approached, and for a moment, she simply stood there, not as someone who had taken something, but as someone who had completed something, something built in silence, shaped by discipline, and now existing fully in the open, not announced, not celebrated, just undeniable. Power does not echo when it settles into place, it becomes quiet, steady, almost invisible to those who do not know where to look. Naomi Carter stood at the window of her apartment as the final light of day faded into a soft glow across the city, the skyline no longer something distant or symbolic, but something integrated into her reality, something she now moved within rather than around. Behind her, the room remained still, the folder resting exactly where she had left it, no longer a collection of plans but a record of completion. She did not reach for it again, because there was nothing left inside that required her attention. Everything it represented had already been set into motion, across the city, in an office that now felt larger and emptier than before. Alexander Whitmore stood alone, the hum of the building around him continuing as it always had, yet no longer aligned with his presence. The reports on his desk were unchanged, the numbers still precise, but the meaning had shifted beyond his control. He traced the sequence again in his mind, not searching for blame, but for understanding, and what he found was not a single mistake, not a single oversight, but a pattern he had never questioned, the assumption that presence equaled influence, that authority meant awareness, that silence meant absence. He exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition. Because recognition was the only thing left that still belonged to him. Back in her apartment, Naomi turned away from the window and moved through the space with the same measured calm that had defined every step of her journey. She poured a glass of water, the simple action grounding, intentional, then set it down untouched, her focus not on habit, but on clarity. Her phone lit briefly with a message from one of her advisors, a confirmation that operations had transitioned smoothly, that leadership adjustments were being received without resistance. She read it once and placed the phone face down, not because it was unimportant, but because it was expected. Stability had always been part of the design. She walked toward the table and rested her hand lightly on the edge, her fingers tracing the surface without urgency, as if acknowledging the space itself, the quiet, the control, the absence of anything that needed to be proven. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware, unchanged, yet subtly influenced by decisions made in rooms it would never see. Across town, Alexander finally stepped away from his desk and moved toward the window, the same skyline stretching before him, familiar and distant at the same time. For the first time in years, he did not see opportunity, he saw structure, a system that responded not to force, but to understanding, and in that realization, he recognized what he had overlooked, not her presence, but her perspective, not her silence, but its purpose. Naomi returned to the window, standing still as the last light disappeared and the city transitioned fully into night, lights emerging one by one, steady, deliberate, mirroring the way she had built everything that now existed around her. She did not feel triumph, not in the way the world defined it. There was no surge of victory, no desire to claim what had been achieved, only a quiet sense of alignment, of something completed exactly as it had been intended. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape the moment, but to settle into it, to recognize that what had once been uncertain, distant, or even impossible had become real not through force, but through patience, through clarity, through the discipline to remain unseen until it mattered most. When she opened them again, her gaze remained steady, the skyline unchanged, yet entirely different, because now, she understood something that few ever truly grasp. Power is not something you take, it is something you position yourself to hold long before anyone else realizes it is available, and once it settles, once it aligns, it does not need to announce itself, it simply exists, undeniable, irreversible, complete. Naomi stepped back from the window and turned off the light, allowing the room to fall into a soft darkness illuminated only by the city beyond, a space defined not by what had been lost or gained, but by what had been understood, and in that understanding, everything else had followed exactly as it was always meant to.